In this class we're going to look at techniques for allocating resources. Now we're going to do this in the context of business planning. A plan has got resource allocation issues. A plan must allocate resources in the future in certain directions in accordance with the plan itself. So there must be techniques for the allocation of resources with the plan. And this is what we're going to look at here. It'll be dealt with in other classes as well, and you'll come across this in several other videos in these classes. So let's start by looking at the assets or the resources of the organization. And these are simply the financial resources of the organization, the physical resources of the organization, for example the buildings, the machinery, the plant, the furniture and fittings, and we've also got the human assets. Considerable in time and effort and investment could have gone into training the staff, and that is an asset of the organization. So there is a human side to the assets of the business. We also have the intangible assets, the goodwill and the intellectual property that's owned by the business. So these are the resources of the business, and this is what must be allocated. The plan will allocate this, and the plan is aiming to achieve some goal in the future. It's aimed at some position in the future, and these are the resources it's got, and it will allocate these in order to achieve the resources. Now hopefully it will do that effectively and efficiently. But one technique that is immediate in the context of the allocation of resources is that of budgeting. Now the budget, well, this is a numerical plan for allocating resources to specific activities within the organization. That's what a budget is. It's a numerical plan for allocating resources to specific activities. So, for example, production will have a budget, marketing will have a budget, specific activities, and it will have an allocation. So budgeting is important, and it's an important way of allocating the resources. And most organizations will have budgets for activities, and they will assess their own efficiency as to whether they are exceed the budget or underdrawn on the budget. So budgeting is important, and it'll cut across production, marketing, HR, administration, finance itself, transport, distribution, and so on. And there'll be a budget for each part of the expenditure of the business, and the business will judge its effectiveness as to whether it is overspent or underspent at the end of the accounting period in those budgets. So that's one technique for allocating resources, and that is a major technique. That's a very important technique that's dealt with in great detail in other videos. Another technique is scheduling. It involves the following components. First of all, it sets out what products or processes that need to be done. So it looks at what needs to be done. It sequences the order in which the activities set out in 1 above must be completed. So it sets out the sequence or order in which the activities must be completed. So first of all, it sets out what needs to be done, and then it sets out the sequence in which they must be completed. One must be completed after the other. It itemizes the capital, the machinery, the personnel, all of the resources that each activity will use. So it must detail all of the resources used. And finally, it specifies a completion date for the activities. Now that's scheduling. Scheduling in its simple form. It sets out what processes need to be done. It sets out the sequence in which they must be completed. It itemizes what's needed to complete each activity in terms of capital, machinery and so on. And it specifies a completion date. It's basic, it's important, but there are better techniques and more sophisticated techniques around. But one way of dealing with that sort of scheduling is by using a Gantt chart. It's a scheduling chart developed by Henry Gantt that shows actual and planned output levels over a period of time. And typically, you can do it on an Excel sheet. Typically, it would look something like that. Different tasks, the number of weeks across the various columns, and the rows would set out the tasks. For example, task B is over 2 weeks. It runs from week 1 to week 3. Task C runs from week 3 to week 4. So it's a simple example. There is a lot of specialist software around for doing more sophisticated charts, and you can check to see what's available online by just typing in Gantt chart and seeing what software is available. The commercial software obviously is quite expensive, so we don't get involved with that in this program, but that's the way it could be developed. There's another example of a chart, a slightly more sophisticated one, but just done out in Excel. There are other techniques, as I said. That's just a very straightforward one, showing the sequences, and it does help scheduling. It shows when the project must be completed, and it shows the resources, and it shows the sequence. So it does contain quite a bit of information, but there are other techniques. Critical path analysis, for example, will show the slack in some of the processes, and it will show the routes when decisions have to be made, which routes should be selected. And it's a slightly more sophisticated technique, and it's dealt with in a separate video. There's also a technique called PERT. This is a flow chart diagram that shows the sequence of activities needed to complete a project and the time and costs associated with it. I'm not going to get into it here. It'll be the subject of another video in a separate module. But for the moment, there is another technique called PERT, and you should be aware that there is such a thing, that there is such a technique. Check it online to see what it says and what it does. But don't get too involved with it. Essentially what we've got here is scheduling, and scheduling is just as I set out earlier, but it can also be represented in a Gantt chart. So it's a picture, if you like, of the processes. More sophisticated again would be the critical path analysis. Cost-benefit analysis is something different again. Critical path analysis, which is a more sophisticated technique, and PERT, which, as I said, I'm not getting into here. So those are some of the techniques used for allocating resources. There are others, but we're not going to get into those at this time. This introduces the various techniques that are, generally speaking, used for straightforward projects. Probably the most important of all would be the budgeting one, and setting up the budgets as set out in other classes also. But that's all I'm going to do on this topic for the moment, so I'm going to leave it at that and say thank you for watching.